This is the US. It's one country, but with two wildly different coasts. Fly from Los Angeles to New York and almost everything changes. The streets are narrower, the buildings are taller, people talk differently, dress differently, even walk at a different pace. The culture's simply different. It's not just that these are different cities, they feel like different countries entirely. And the numbers back this up. The average population density of the Northeast is around 1,000 people per square mile. In California, it's closer to 250. In Boston, the median home was built in 1963. In Seattle, it's 1984. These aren't small differences, they're generational gaps. But why is this? Why do America's two coasts feel so fundamentally distinct? Why does the East feel old, dense, and urgent, while the West feels sprawling, casual, and new? And more importantly, how did this happen when they're both part of the same country, governed by the same federal laws, shaped by the same broader American culture? Well, first we must acknowledge that there's even quite a lot of internal differences on each respective coast. I mean, LA, San Francisco, and the Pacific Northwest are different, as is New York City, Charleston, and Miami. But for the sake of this video, we're mostly comparing the West versus the Northeast. The two poles of American urban life that seem to represent almost opposite approaches to how a city should work. And to understand why these coasts diverged so dramatically, the timeline goes back to even before America was founded, back when the British first began establishing settlements in North America in the 17th century, shaped largely by their pursuit of economic opportunity and religious freedom. But we don't need to go in depth about why they came here or even how, but rather what they created. See, when you're establishing a settlement in the 1600s, your options are extremely limited. There are no cars, trains, electricity. The fastest you can move is on horseback, and most people can't even afford them. So everything had to be within walking distance, but they also had to be near ports, as that's what sustained the city. So buildings stacked close together because that's how you maximized limited space near the harbor. And as these cities grew, they grew on top of themselves. And critically, the distances between them were short. You could travel between major cities in days, not weeks. This proximity allowed the colonies to communicate, trade, and eventually unify into something cohesive. New York City was founded in 1624, Boston in 1630, Newark in 1666, and Philadelphia in 1682, along with their grid plan, just to name a few. By the time the US was founded in 1776, the East Coast basically already had over 100 years of European development behind it. The institutions came early too, almost immediately. Harvard was founded in 1636, Yale followed in 1701, Princeton in 1746. All of this created a particular kind of society, hierarchical, institutional, and traditional. Wealth accumulated over generations. Status came from education, family name, and connections. As decades passed and the East became even more entrenched in their ideals, the US as a whole was changing. There was a desire to look west. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight. Napoleon had just reacquired the territory from Spain, but a Haitian Revolution and an inevitable war with the UK meant his focus was on Europe, not America. He needed funds fast, so he offered to sell the entire territory to the US. For just $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre, the US acquired 828,000 square miles of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. Suddenly, there was land, unimaginable amounts of it. But this was only the half of it. The West Coast still wasn't theirs yet. During the 1840s, the British still claimed the Pacific Northwest. Mexico controlled most of the Southwest, and Texas was independent. But there was an ideology taking hold that meant this was only temporary. Manifest destiny. This wasn't a specific policy, but a belief system that Americans were divinely ordained to expand its territory across the North American continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And so the expansion continued, much to the complete detriment of the Native Americans, of course. This is when we really started to see migration to the West Coast, and when we started to see the cultures diverge from the East Coast. Let me explain. It took a certain type of person to go west at the time. It wasn't like moving to a new city. It was like leaving civilization entirely. Using the westward trails, the journey across the continent was brutal. Deserts, mountains, hostile terrain, minimal infrastructure. It took months, and up to 10% of everyone who made that trip didn't survive. So, who were the people moving given all this? Well, it wasn't the people who were thriving in the East, not the ones with good jobs, stable families, and comfortable positions in the social hierarchy. The people who went west were the ones who had reasons to leave. The people who looked at the established order of the East Coast and felt it just wasn't working for them. The misfits, dreamers, failures, and risk-takers. The very act of going west filtered for a specific type of person. Someone more interested in possibility rather than security, and someone who valued freedom over structure. And of course, this was only supercharged in 1848, when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California and word spread. Known as the California Gold Rush, hundreds of thousands of people abandoned their lives and headed west with nothing but the hope of striking it rich, unleashing the largest and fastest migration in US history. It also drew people from a dozen countries to form a multi-ethnic society on America's fringe, which is another factor we'll get into later: immigration. San Francisco went from a settlement of about 800 people in 1848 to over 25,000 by 1850. And when most of them didn't find gold, they didn't go home. They stayed and built the states with the same mentality. Around this time, the continental borders of the US were finally locked in as well. Congress assisted them with laws to encourage settlement. For example, the Homestead Act of 1862 granted 160 acres of free land to any American willing to move west, live on it for 5 years, and improve it, effectively turning migration into a government-subsidized gamble on opportunity. This is also when the iconic Wild West time period started. That's why today, when you compare the cultures of the East and West Coast, the West has more of a pioneer spirit that you could reinvent yourself, while the live and let live attitude that emerged from diverse strangers trying to coexist in frontier towns became the West Coast's famous tolerance and laid-back social norms. This is around the time when many West Coast cities were getting founded in the mid-1800s, but they were still tiny. Los Angeles had a population of 5,000 in 1870, Portland 8,000, San Diego 2,300, and Seattle of just 1,000. They hadn't really locked into a fixed urban form, unlike, say, New York's 1811 Commissioner's Plan, and only really began to grow from the early 20th century. And this is where we get to the difference in urban design. See, like I said before, East Coast cities developed in a time where cities had to be super dense and walkable. But this wasn't true on the West Coast, because cities were able to expand outward along public transportation from the beginning, and later even farther once cars arrived. I know that sounds crazy to say in a sentence, West Coast and public transportation, but it's true. Take Southern California, for example. Electric trolleys first appeared in LA in 1887, and a decade later we had the Los Angeles Pacific Railroad, an electric public transit system that had 230 miles of track extending from downtown Los Angeles to Santa Monica and the South Bay. There was also the Los Angeles Railway streetcar system that started in 1895, which functioned like a metro, while the eventual Pacific Electric Railway Company, nicknamed the Red Cars, connected cities in Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and Riverside County as a commuter rail. It was even the largest electric railway system in the world by the 1920s. Eventually, the rail usage declined though, and by that same decade, cars were no longer luxury items and became more affordable. As we know, the rest is history, and it became the city with the most cars per capita in the US. So what I'm saying is that basically the West Coast was still flexible when sprawl became possible. And that's why the coasts look so different. By the time Los Angeles became a major city, a city like Boston was already almost 300 years old. Immigration also played a part in this. The East Coast was shaped by waves of Europeans, especially coming through Ellis Island at the time, creating cities built on dense, old-world neighborhoods and long-established ethnic communities. The West Coast, meanwhile, drew a very different mix: Mexican and Central American migrants from the South, Chinese laborers, and later broader Asian immigration from the Pacific, and a far more international flow overall. Its cities grew up far less tied to the traditional European style. Now we get to the economics of the coasts. On the East Coast, it's very traditional, even old money. Banking, finance, research, and medicine is what dominates. Even in the entertainment scene, theater and fine arts are preferred. While on the West Coast, we see tech, venture capital, and Hollywood being what dominates. Much more recent industries. Of course, this also plays into the culture too. See, because societal structures and traditional power hierarchy is much more entrenched in the East Coast, the work culture usually is too, from dress attire to punctuality to overall rigidness. Meanwhile, many will talk of work culture in the West being way more laid back, less stressful, and more casual. People being late, people wearing whatever to work, people just letting loose in general. This comes back to the West having that anything goes kind of vibe since it was settled by pioneers, adventurers, and outlaws. Remember too that before tech it was the film industry that put, well, specifically California on the map. It's an inherently artsy industry full of eccentrics, characterized by costumes rather than uniforms, and draws on relatively young people for talent. It probably played an important role in keeping the West Coast relatively casual as its industry dominance and populace transitioned from laborious frontier industries to more urban ones. This possibly manifests itself in the manners of people who live on each coast as well. For example, when you ask most Americans about East versus West Coast people, many will bring up how they act. The running stereotype is that the West Coast is nice but not kind, and that the East Coast is not nice but kind. Basically, bluntness versus passive-aggressiveness. There's also that the East Coast is more communitarian and the West Coast more individualistic, and that the East Coast is still socially more conservative than the West. But again, these are generalizations, no offense to anyone of course. Lastly, we have the weather. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans bring very contrasting climates to the two coasts. In the east, warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico collides constantly with cold Arctic air from Canada, and the warm Atlantic helps fuel storms traveling west to east. This creates huge temperature swings, dramatic storms, and a climate that truly experiences all four seasons. While on the west coast, a cold Pacific current flows down from Alaska, keeping coastal temperatures mild, and the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Mountains block most of the continent's extreme weather from ever reaching the coast. This gives the region a much different climate. In Southern California, it's basically warm year-round, while everything north of San Francisco gets a real winter in the form of rain, mist, and the occasional snowstorm. In the end, both coasts are needed for making America the strongest country in the world. The tri-state area and Greater Los Angeles are the two richest and most populated metropolitan areas in the US by far, essentially carrying this country. Wall Street at the center of global finance and Silicon Valley at the center of technology are pivotal to US domination. Which coast do you prefer though? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.